We're delighted to have with us here today Heathcliff Farrugia, Chief Executive Officer of the Malta Gaming Authority. Heathcliff, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for the invite.
So, well, thank you for your time. Just to begin, how do you see the current panorama at the moment in Europe and specifically in Malta? Both land-based gaming and online gaming, as countries are starting to emerge from lockdown?
Well, obviously this COVID, this pandemic took many by surprise. Nobody was expecting it. Nobody was aware that this was coming, and even more, nobody was aware of the impact it was going to have. But then all of a sudden, all operators in the various industries, they had to adapt, and they had to adapt quickly. And those who, in my opinion, managed to adapt quicker than others, they managed to a certain extent, limit the damages. In terms of the gaming industry, obviously, as an industry, this industry is not immune to the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, there were impacts on various operators, but the impacts varied between the type of operators. You mentioned, for example, land-based, and then if you want, I can explain even the remote. When it comes to land-based, if you look at Europe, it was, I would say, pretty much each and every European country has shut down or suspended any land-based activity. So the brick and mortar casino, the betting shops, if you look at even the national lotteries, anything which required, which had the physical presence, so clients had to walk into the shop, they were suspended or closed. Here in Malta, that happened on the 17th March. So practically from the 17th March onwards, for those type of operators, so practically their revenues went down to zero. Their revenues. So there isn't much to discuss there. Ultimately, revenues went down to zero. So these had issues which were related even to cash flow, to liquidity. They had issues related to keeping their employees. And this was the same pretty much across all Europe. And what happened then, a number of governments, the Maltese government included, looked at various industries, obviously even at the gaming industry, and they assisted with a number of financial aids. Here in Malta, there were predominantly two types of financial aid. One of them was what the government called the wage supplement scheme, whereby government gave operators, based on the national minimum wage, they gave operators a monthly salary for each and every employee they had. So, for example, land-based casinos, even though they were closed, they were still able to keep their employees. Fine, potentially not exactly on the same wage they had, but at least they were able to give their employees a salary which was being given to them by the government, and they were forwarding this salary in its entirety to the employees. These measures are still on, and from the most recent announcement of government, the plan is to keep them for May as well, and for June, the full month as well. Then whether or not they get extended, obviously depends on the government's decision. However, they had, apart from this issue, apart from these financial aid packages, then there were also those related to taxes. So government, for those industries which were considered hit, and we need to keep in mind that land-based activity, it was directly hit. Why? Because it was also part of a legal notice issued by government. So government here in Malta issued, I believe, legal notice 76 of 2020, whereby it specifically closed all land-based activity. So any company which was closed because of a land-based activity, they could benefit then from the wage supplement scheme, and also from the tax deferrals. So practically a number of taxes. So even the gaming taxes, the VAT, income tax, even NI, those were all shifted. Those were all deferred. And obviously that gave at least that additional cash flow for these companies to at least still survive during this period. Now, in terms of the land-based, in Malta and even in some other European countries, we're seeing the first signs of the tunnel. In Malta, the lotto booths were allowed to reopen last week. So the national lottery is now back in its operation. Obviously, even the lotto booths, yes, they were allowed to open. However, obviously, there are a number of health-related restrictions, obviously. So the social distancing, people need to wear a mask before they enter the shop. So there are a number of restrictions like any other retail outlets currently being allowed to open. But that, at least in terms of the operators, at least they will start generating some form of revenue. So at least that particular industry will start recovering. And then what's very positive here, the government decided to still, even for these companies who are allowed to open, the government wage supplement scheme will still apply. So even though they will be allowed to operate, since the government is aware that ultimately they will never start operating exactly like they were pre-COVID. So even though, for example, Lotto Boots were allowed to open last week, if I'm not mistaken, 16th May, for the remaining days of May, and also for the full month of June, they will still be benefiting from the wage supplement scheme and from the tax deferrals. And the government did that so that at least it gives these type of companies at least some breathing space and some time to recover and get back on track. If you look then at the remote gaming, we had a different type of operators. As you might be aware, there are what we call the traditional online casinos. And for online casinos, during COVID, we've seen an increase. It wasn't an increase in activity because initially there was sort of the idea or the thought, the impression was that the surge in activity was huge. In reality, it wasn't huge. It wasn't low, but we're looking at 10 to 15% increase in terms of activity. And what we're trying to understand is where this increase is coming from, whether or not it was from the same players who are now locked inside and betting more, playing more. So that would be an issue in terms of the responsible gaming aspect, or whether it was a switch between players who were used to sort of attend or go to the traditional brick and mortar casino, but now some of them decided that since they cannot go to the casino, they are logging onto a website and experiencing online casino. We are still trying to understand. So for those type of operators, but we haven't seen any major negative impacts because of COVID-19. Then obviously they had the issues with their employees. Some of them had employees who had to work from home, but that happened to any other industry. What's interesting then to look at is the sports betting operators. Obviously, because the major sports tournaments across Europe were suspended, this had a direct impact on the sports betting operators. We estimate that by the 15th of March, pretty much the major European leagues and the major sport events were pretty much suspended. If you look at the Premier League, if you look at Serie A, Bundesliga, La Liga, Ligue 1 of France, even if you look at, for example, the Nations Cup, the European Nations Cup. Obviously, the European Nations Cup is a very popular event in Europe that was suspended. Even if you look at events like, for example, the Eurovision Song Contest, it is a very popular event with betting operators, but that was suspended as well. So all of a sudden, these operators had to wake up and face a reality which was even looking at operators having 70, 80, 90% drop in activity from one day to the other. So it was the impact on these type of operators was quite significant, I must say. And a number of operators started looking at different forms of betting options. One of them being eSports. And here, eSports, there were some positives and potentially negatives, so some risks in terms of the eSports. Obviously, we've seen a surge in activity when it comes to esports, so that we can confirm. Why? Because operators who, in the absence of traditional sports events, they had no option but to try and offer something to their players. It was coming from both. So sometimes we look at it just from the operator's perspective. However, what we cannot underestimate is the fact that the players want to bet as well, because sometimes we look at it from the operator's angle, saying because operators, they want to ensure their revenue. But yes, we need to look at it from the player's perspective. Players also want to have something to bet on. They want to have an event to follow. And this wasn't possible. So esports was seen as an option, and operators who were already offering esports betting, obviously they had an advantage. However, others were equipped to adapt. Now, having said that, esports was, we do not see it. So at least from what we've seen, from the figures, yes, there was an increase in esports betting, but we do not consider it as in any way being equivalent or close to being equivalent to the traditional sports. So the traditional sports are way more popular than esports. However, esports, we've seen an increase in activity by a number of operators. Now, whether or not that increase or that spike in activity vis-a-vis sports, that will remain there post-COVID or post the return of the traditional sports leagues, predominantly the football leagues, that is something which we need to assess. We believe that there will still be some popularity, so we do not believe that post-COVID situation, esports will go back exactly to the same levels it had before, because we believe that some of the players who experienced esports for the first time will most probably still remain interested. Now, the level of interest and whether or not that would be big enough to reduce their interest in traditional sports, that is something which is still to be seen. But it's interesting. Then, in terms of esports per se, what we need to keep in mind as well is that the type of game from a regulator's perspective now, and that's why I said that we are closely monitoring the esports situation and we are closely monitoring its increase or not post-COVID. Because from a regulatory perspective, esports is considered riskier. And I'll explain why. Esports is less regulated to a certain extent. So whereas in the traditional sports, you have FIFA, you have UEFA, you have a governing body issuing guidelines to the players, how they need to behave in terms of they control even the validity of the game, the transparency of the game, making sure the game is fair. In terms of esports, that is not exactly the case. We are aware and we are in contact already with a couple of associations, with a couple of bodies who are representing or starting to represent some form of esports, and that's a very positive development from our perspective. But ultimately, esports is still considered riskier because there aren't enough controls in place, and sort of the manipulation of a game is easier sometimes. And what we did over the past days, we issued even a public notice to operators, cognizant of the fact that operators obviously were looking at esports. We issued a note giving guidelines to operators and to the public in general to make sure that they do not just offer bets on any esports event. There are very serious esports events, very well organized, where there are regulations in place, so that those we are okay with. But our guidelines were, and our notice to our operators were, not to sort of rush to offering bets on any esports event, because then the risk of being in a situation whereby the game, the tournament is not properly set up, is not well organized, then the risks were higher than usual.
Would you welcome the creation of stronger regulatory bodies for esports?
Definitely, and I think that if esports and if esports in general, if us regulators, if from a regulatory perspective, we see that esports keeps increasing, even if not necessarily at the levels which is increasing now, because obviously it's because COVID, then from our end, we will be in a situation whereby either esports have their own regulations, or else we won't be able to allow our operators to offer bets on those events, because we cannot be in a situation whereby esports events are offered, but bets are placed, but without having the necessary safeguards, both for the players and for the validity of the event, for the integrity of the sports events. And we're already seeing signs. There are already two major associations who are very serious about what they are doing. They even control the players. They issue guidelines. So there are some serious associations on this front. And most probably, the future for esports and the betting on esports, obviously, because we do not get into the actual esports per se, but in terms of the betting on esports, most probably we will get to a situation in future whereby we would be allowing only certain type of bets on those which are considered the series events, the series tournament, those who are well organized, who have proper structure, and who have practically everything in place.
Great. And I mean, some countries, or the regulators in certain countries in Europe have introduced temporary restrictions of different kinds during the period of the pandemic, from restrictions on advertising to imposing deposit limits. But would you say you've seen no evidence that such temporary restrictions are warranted to protect players during this period?
Rather than seeing no evidence, then every regulator, I would say unfortunately, but every regulator across EU proceeds pretty much, every country I would say, proceeds pretty much on their own. There is, yes, collaboration and consultation, but pretty much every country can decide to come up with initiatives aimed at protecting their own players. From our perspective, from an MJ perspective, we believe a lot on having on taking evidence-based decisions. We do not believe that decisions should be taken simply on assumptions. So for us, having data, looking at data, making sure that the decisions we are taking are based on evidence, for us it's very, very important. The evidence to substantiate their decision, potentially they were a bit, I would say, even overboard. And one thing we cannot underestimate is what we call the illegal market, the black market. We need to understand that whenever we pose restrictions on the licensed operators, those who are properly regulated, those who follow the AML guidelines, those who are paying taxes in the various countries, when we issue regulations on those, when we issue restrictions on those, we need to keep in mind that at the same time, the illegal side, the black market, they won't have any of these restrictions. So we can end up in a situation whereby we try to protect players by being more restrictive, but at the same time, we risk making the illegal offering, those operators operating in the black market, we risk making their offer even more attractive. Why? Because they do not need to pay taxes, they do not need to have restrictions. So ultimately, that balancing act is very, very important. And in my opinion, more needs to be done on controlling the illegal market, the black market.
How do you see the development of regulation across Europe over the next couple of years, as more countries still developing their regulated market? Do you think there's any chance for more convergence among regulators, or will we continue to see this very patchwork approach to regulation in different countries?
I think for the time being, so in the near future, it will be even more fragmentation, in my opinion. So even more countries will keep regulating on a state-by-state approach for the near future. I believe that in future we will collaborate more, and in the future there will be more regulatory convergence, because then the moment everyone starts having its own regulations, it's already started to happening in reality. If you look at the regulations of the various countries, they are pretty much, I would say, a copy of each other. And why is this? Very, very simple. Because ultimately, all regulators, we have the same objectives. We all want to protect the vulnerable players. We all want to make sure that games are fair and transparent. And we all want to make sure that there is no criminality, and that sort of criminality is kept apart from gaming. So the objectives are the same. So once all regulators have the same objectives, then it should be much, much easier to collaborate. Now, the issue we have is that in Europe currently, we have operators who have what? To operate in Europe, they have 18, 19 different licenses from different jurisdictions. And many a times these regulations overlap. So you have the same requirements being asked, being done, the same checks being conducted by the same regulators in the different countries. So we end up in a situation whereby a licensed operator is literally being asked the same questions by different operators. So we believe that in future, I don't think it will happen anytime soon, to be honest, but I believe that in future, there will be more effort on regulatory convergence. And to be honest, between us regulators, we do collaborate already a lot. So we do collaborate a lot, we exchange information, we even discuss areas of mutual interest. So there is a lot of collaboration. But I believe, to be honest, it has to be at an EU level. So just like, for example, there are directives which are, I don't know, the data protection, the anti-money laundering directive, which are EU, which are applicable across all EU. I believe that in future there will be something which is similar for for gaming. But being very honest, I think we are still a bit far from that.
Mm. At the Malta Gaming Authority, in recent months, you've announced a series of data sharing agreements with different sporting bodies. Just yesterday, another one was announced with the World Professional Billiard and Snooker Association. Is that something you see as an important part of the regulator's role, and that's something you're continuing to develop?
Yes, Joe. We believe a lot in collaboration, and collaboration cannot be on a local level only. If every country takes action in its country without collaborating internationally, we believe that's not enough. We all know that crime is an international thing. There are criminal organizations committing crimes on an international level. So likewise, regulators in different jurisdictions, they need to collaborate. In terms of the ones you mentioned, if you have seen recently, we focused a lot on the sports. And this is mainly because in 2018, we had our sports integrity unit. So we literally have a unit which is focused on sports integrity. And for us to share the information, whereas we have the operator, we have the right to ask for information from our operators. So if we ask for betting patterns of particular matches from our licensed operators, obviously we are the regulator, so they need to give it to us. But there is no law covering the exchange of information. So the operator is obliged to send us the information we ask for, but unless there are these agreements with the various sporting bodies, unless there are these agreements in place, we are unable to share that data. So the scope of having these agreements is for us to allow us to share that data with the particular sporting bodies for them to investigate. And when you look at sports integrity, which is very important for us, obviously many of us love the sport, and we want to make sure that betting on the sport does not lead to creating issues in the sport. So for us, collaborating on the sports integrity front is key, is one of the main pillars. And if you look at the agreements we conduct, this was predominantly, and we have a number of other agreements lined up. Obviously, there are discussions, because when you are signing a data sharing agreement or an MOU with another entity, obviously there are a number of discussions in place. But yes, in future we will keep seeing more, because we want to make sure that each and every sport on which there are bets being placed on by one of our licensed entities, we want to make sure that there is a data sharing agreement with the respective sporting body, with the respective governing body in place, so that the moment there is an investigation going on, the moment there is the need to share information, we are immediately able to share the information to make sure that we protect the integrity of the sport.
Excellent. Now, just with the market reaching such saturation in Europe now, a lot of companies are looking at other markets. Latin America is a market that many companies have their eye on, but there are very few countries in Latin America that have developed a regulated market so far. What recommendations could you give to countries in Latin America who are looking to develop their regulated market?
Well, from our end, I think it's a valid point. From our end, we are seeing a lot happening in Latin America, and a lot happening even in terms of on the regulatory front. We are in touch with a number of countries, and we are assisting a number of them, even because since we've been in the industry now for over 15 years, we're one of the first countries regulated remote gaming. We are many a times asked to even attend conferences there. This year, I believe we had 3 or 4 invites to go there, and we assist them, and we help them. We give them our views on how this industry should be regulated. And obviously this year everything got cancelled, but we're assisting where we can. We assist online, we assist via video conferencing. So what we always believe, Joe, that ultimately banning or stopping an activity can never help the industry. So our suggestion to them is to regulate and regulate properly. Do not over-regulate, but regulate and regulate properly, because the only way to stop the illegal market, the only way to stop those who are operating in the black market, where, let's not forget that when an operator is operating in the black market, there are no responsible gaming measures in place. They do not have any obligation to make sure that they don't have duty of care. So they are not obliged to make sure that that if a player is showing problem gambling patterns, they intervene and they pay no taxes. There is none of these. So we believe that the only way to stop this type of activity is not by banning, is not by stopping an industry, but by regulating properly. Regulating properly in the sense that you make sure that the regulations you have are not just there simply for having regulations, but they are there to help you reach your objectives.
Excellent. Okay, well, excellent, and thank you for taking the time to be with us. Is there anything that you would like to add before we finish?
No, I think from my end it was a pleasure. It was a very interesting interview. I just hope that, like many others in this industry, but not just in this industry, I hope that this current situation gets over sooner rather than later, so that we start having some form of normality. We've seen already some light at the end of the tunnel. We've seen some initial movements in a number of countries. Let's just hope that we are on the right track and that we start living the life we had before as soon as possible.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Heathcliff. Thank you for joining us to share your thoughts.
Thanks.